Are there things that Christians should know? Absolutely. The more you actually know instead of just believing, instead of just having faith, the better. Of course, Christian apologists don't want you to actually know anything about demonstrable reality because that'll just get them out of power and it'll get the believers out of the pews and out into the real world, and the collection plates will just gather dust. And that's all they're after. That's all they want. So let's see another example of this and why their takes are always so absurdly terrible. Coming up next. Today, we're going to do an Alisa Childers video. I think we've only done one of those before, and then only tangentially, but you probably remember more than I do because I'm an old man and I don't remember shit. She wants to provide 5 apologetics questions that every Christian should know the answer to, but I'm sure those answers will only be one-sided, with only the pro-Christian position represented. So I'm going to show why not only is that dishonest, but it's also not where reality lies. Then again, these people couldn't care less about reality, could they? They just really want to believe. So let's get to it.
1 Peter 3:15 says, "In your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect."
And then you get people like Mike Winger making excuses because every time Christians try to get that with the non-religious, they just get their asses handed to them. I'm sure they get tired of that, don't you? Granted, I have no problem with using the Bible against Christians. After all, they believe it. They should at least follow what it says, right? Even if most of them don't. Most of them have never even read it cover to cover. Most of them just cherry pick or just listen to the crap that comes from the pulpit because that's really all they ever believe. They just really want to believe the stuff that sounds good to them, so that's all they pay attention to. So, assuming that Alisa's going to hold Christians accountable to 1 Peter 3:15, and I think that's a good sign, let's see how far she's willing to go with this. I don't think it's going to turn out well for her in the end, but hey, let's go see.
Every Christian is called to be prepared to make a defense for what we believe.
Sadly, it doesn't say an intelligent defense, a defense in line with reality, a defense that is actually, defensible. For far too many, it's just about spouting emotionally comforting bullshit because they just want to be happy. If you remember back to the Mike Winger video, and if you want to rewatch it, it's in his playlist, he basically said, well, maybe you just get a good feeling believing in God, or maybe you had an experience. Yeah, I'm not going to deny that something happened to you, but you can't show that God actually had anything to do with it. That's always fun when Christians offer their testimony. Ask them how they justify their beliefs that any God of any kind was actually responsible. Ask them for their evidence, because they don't have any. They can't do it, at least not without appealing to faith. But hey, give it a shot because it's funny to watch them squirm. So I guess the only potential out that the religious have here is that the Bible isn't clear what quality the reasons have to be. If you're willing to go with pathetically stupid, almost anything will do. And that's not going to convince anybody outside of their cult, but the religious don't care about that, do they?
And the word that's used here, translated into English as defense, is the Greek word apologia. And this is where we get our English word apologetics.
And if you look up apologia, it is just a formal defense of an opinion, position, or action. It also doesn't specify that the defense has to be rational, based on evidence, logic, or reason, or be supported in any way. Will I say so? Yeah, but that's not a worthwhile defense, is it? But it is all the religious really have. Don't let them get away with it. Call them out on it every single step of the way. They're not going to like that much, but hey, you should do it anyhow. Heck, do what I do and make the identical claim, no matter what it is, about invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies. Make up your own fantasy critter. It really doesn't matter. If they can rely on faith, so can you, even if your faith is just ridiculing their own. They will never understand why it's a problem, because they don't care. But we want it to be true. Okay, so what? All you're doing is showing just how irrational and delusional you actually are, and your responses are only going to highlight the stupidity of their positions. They are doing themselves absolutely no favors whatsoever. Not that they care.
Apologetics just means giving a reason for what you believe. And when it comes to the realm of Christian apologetics, this can span a lot of different disciplines like science, logic, philosophy, and history.
Except you don't have any of that. There is nothing in science that points to the existence of any gods whatsoever. That's why they're not using science. They are just asserting God done it, because they really want God to have done it. That doesn't mean that God done it. Stop them right there too and point out that you can do the exact same thing. Magical leprechauns done it. You're just doing what they're doing after all. Why can't you do that? You're just making them look stupid, because that's what they are. That's all they've got going for them anyhow, right? So they don't have science. They don't have history, because the things they believe are not historically valid, especially when it comes to the supernatural. History can say absolutely nothing about that. That's the realm of science, and as we already said, they've got nothing to rely on there. Philosophy? Every single stupid philosophical argument they employ is easy to debunk because they're all fallacious and rely on premises that cannot be justified to be true. In every single one, either the premises are hopelessly fallacious or the conclusion does not arise from the premises offered. It's just a shit show. What else is new?
Christian apologetics basically has two goals. Number one, to provide reasons why Christianity is true.
And it does that very, very badly. That's the problem. Ask them for any kind of rational defense for their defense, and the whole thing will just fall apart. What they're doing is pretty much just like claiming, well, Elvis is still alive because apples are blue. I'm sorry, but apples aren't blue. I mean, there are claims that Japan grows some, but those, at least to the best of my knowledge, they're the result of genetic manipulation. And even if they were blue, that has nothing at all to do with Elvis still being alive. It's a complete non sequitur. The conclusion or statement does not logically follow from the previous argument or statement. Look at the trees, which is a very common Christian argument, proves nothing about any God. Just stapling "therefore God" on the end of it doesn't mean anything if you have not presented any evidence that God is real in the first place. That's where Christian apologetics always falls down. It comes down to, well, it sounds good to me, but that means absolutely nothing. It doesn't prove that your beliefs are true, and that's what you need to do. But they're just not interested at all, are they?
And number two, to communicate those reasons to the world.
You're doing so very, very badly. That's why Christianity is falling apart. You have not shown that your beliefs are rational or valid in any demonstrable way. In fact, you're just making shit up because it makes you happy, and that is one of the dumbest things that any human being could conceivably do, yet the religious embrace it, don't they? Sorry, you've got nothing that is going to convince anyone else, anyone outside of your cult, and that's why they're not talking to us. They're not trying to present anything to the world that would convince the world that they have any clue what the hell they're doing. They're just talking to each other because they're the only ones that take any of this bullshit seriously. And that's kind of a problem if you think about it. Too bad the religious never do.
Now, this can seem overwhelming if you've never studied apologetics before. There can be all kinds of different questions people have, skeptical claims brought against Christianity.
And that's what Christians ought to understand, but they don't. They don't want to. That's the position I found myself in way back when. I wanted to understand if Christianity was actually true. I was firmly convinced that it was, and that embarking on an in-depth investigation of the evidence would prove that I was absolutely correct, even though it didn't. That's why I'm not a Christian anymore. However, most Christians are terrified to put their faith to the test because they don't actually care if it's true. If they did, they would do exactly what I did. They'd get out there and say, how do I justify this with the best evidence and the best information that I can? They'd leave their comfort zone, they'd set aside their faith, and they would put every single aspect of their faith to the test. Then we just have a lot of atheists after that, because Christianity doesn't stand up to any kind of critical scrutiny. At least if people are willing to be honest about it, which I don't think most Christians are. Because that's not what Christianity teaches. They can't have people leaving their congregations left and right, so they tell people to just sit in the pews, listen and believe, don't ask questions, don't have doubts, and fill the collection plates every single week, because that's what religion is all about. Then, when people actually do have questions, legitimate questions, the apologists have tons of excuses for why you shouldn't actually ask any of those hard questions, because they don't want to have to get real jobs either. They take cash, credit cards, and PayPal. Have a nice day.
Today, we're going to talk through 5 basic apologetics questions that I think every Christian should be prepared to answer.
We're finally getting there, huh? Well, we'll see through 1 or 2 of them in this video, with more coming next week or so. But I want to answer these, whatever they are because I haven't seen it, in some detail because I'm willing to bet that these are going to be terrible questions and that the religious have no actual answers. This is a problem, but it's not a problem that they are willing to admit to. I wish they would, I wish they could, and we'll see more as she gets into the questions, but I really have my doubts. I haven't seen where we're going to go yet, and I purposely didn't go look at her description just in case she listed them down there, because I want to go into this fresh and blind. So anyway, go ahead, give us the first question, and we'll see if it's a question that anybody with a brain should consider. Or they should consider it, but probably not come to the same conclusion that the religious always come to, because those answers are unsupported and stupid. So, hit us with it, Alisa. Let's see what you got.
Now, this can seem overwhelming when we see the broad spectrum of skeptical claims that's brought against Christianity, or the many questions brought about by honest seekers. So my goal today is certainly not to give an extensive answer to each one of these questions, but maybe to give the start of an answer, maybe show you a couple of ways to think about each of these questions, and then I'm going to give you resources at the end of each question so that you can learn more if it's a question that interests you.
That's a whole lot of bullshit you're spouting there, isn't it? It's also really, really common. They won't give you any actual answers. They'll just throw some stuff at the wall and hope something sticks, but they'll give you other homework to go do on your own because they've got no time to deal with that, do they? Why not? I don't know. I might not say if she was on a stage somewhere and there was a hard time limit, but this is a video on YouTube. She could take all the time in the world, but she doesn't have anything intelligent to say. She has no excuses for why she can't go into any of these questions in detail, because I don't think she really knows anything. Most of them don't. Or if she knows things, she's certainly not going to tell you that, because then again, she'd have to go out and get a real job. Of course, that puts pressure on her, and the more she talks, the more chances there are for her to be demonstrably wrong, because I don't think most apologists actually know that much, or are honest enough to say so, if they do, as I said before. That's why they rely on script so often. They have no actual information, and certainly no rational defense for any of it, so they'll say a few comforting things that they know will appeal to their intended audience, and then they'll just push it off on somebody else. Go read this book or go listen to this sermon. And if you don't like what they're saying, well, that's not Alisa's problem, is it? She can just feign ignorance and move on to something else. She doesn't actually take the heat for any additional questions that people really ought to have. It's no wonder why I call these people idiots and liars for the Lord. It's really all they are.
So number 1, have the New Testament documents been corrupted?
That's irrelevant, since you haven't proven that they were ever true in the first place. This is immediately where the religious go wrong. They just assume that their stupid books are true, without having any independent evidence to back any of it up. It doesn't matter if, from the moment that quill was set to parchment, the books never changed one bit, even though we know that they did. Because if they were never actually true in the first place, if the things that the person wrote down never really happened, what the hell difference does it make? You've got to prove that part, and that's the part they're not even trying to do. This is why faith has to be the first thing out the window. Faith doesn't mean anything. If the story of Jesus isn't accurate, then it doesn't matter if the Bible has changed. It's not telling the factually correct story that actually happened in the real world. And that's what matters. Keep in mind, I'm not saying that it isn't true. I'm just saying that the burden of proof is on the side of the people who say that it is. And my book says a thing doesn't remotely get you there. You have to be able to corroborate these tales in some way other than, it's in my book. Nobody cares about your book. Do better, because you really have to.
Well, obviously, when the New Testament was being written, we didn't have a printing press, so each manuscript had to be copied by hand. And when the original documents no longer exist, scholars use a science called textual criticism to reconstruct the wording of ancient texts.
Which doesn't mean anything at all in this case. Sure, if you're trying to establish if the written work says the same thing now as it did way back when the author wrote it, you can use textual criticism and compare various copies to see if they're all saying the same thing. I mean, that's great and all, but it means absolutely nothing here. I care if the stories are actually accurate. I care if the things that they claim happened actually happened as recorded. That's what you've got to demonstrate, not just the book says the same thing now as it did when it was written, because that's irrelevant. The Homeric epics record things that we know now did happen, and a lot of things that we're pretty sure never did. The gods and goddesses aren't real and all that, at least based on the evidence that we have. Some Homer apologists could have just demanded, well, the stories are the same now as they were in the time of Homer, so they just have to be true. But they'd just get laughed off stage, wouldn't they? There's a long period of time when a giant game of telephone was going on before anybody wrote anything down about Jesus. How do you know that any real events, if there were actually real events, were accurately recorded by the Bible writers? You're going to have to prove that. So walk us through the process of how you got there with your extensive evidence to back it up, and we will evaluate your claims. Go ahead. We'll wait.
When they have a lot of manuscripts and early manuscripts, they can do this with a great deal of accuracy. The New Testament documents have more manuscripts and earlier manuscripts to support their accuracy than any work of ancient classical literature.
Which means absolutely nothing. A lot of copies of a lie is still a lie. The religious have to demonstrate that the actual historical events that they believe happened were recorded accurately and truthfully, and they simply can't do that. More than 500 million copies of Harry Potter have been sold. That doesn't prove there's a real place called Hogwarts. Nobody's trying to say that the Bible doesn't exist. Nobody denies that. We're asking if what it records is accurate and historically truthful, and that's not something for which any evidence exists, especially when you get to the supernatural claims. That's the part that you have to be able to back up, and you're not even making an effort. And that's kind of a problem, wouldn't you say?
In fact, most scholars agree that the New Testament has been copied with an unprecedented high level of accuracy. There's really just a very small percentage of variations between the manuscripts that affect the meaning of the text. And among those, there isn't one that calls into question any cardinal Christian doctrine.
But the doctrines aren't based on the actual historical accuracy. That's all taken on faith. And I'm not interested in your faith, I'm interested in your facts. Even if not one word has changed between the day the anonymous authors penned the Gospels and today, that doesn't say anything about the truth of what those original anonymous authors had to say. That's why the Bible is completely useless in coming to an accurate understanding of the actual historical events, if they were actual historical events in the first place. That's why you need independent attestation and evidentiary corroboration to the events in question, and you simply don't have any. It doesn't matter how accurately the Bible has been copied if the stories in the Bible were never true to begin with, and you simply can't show that they were. This is never going to change, but the religious don't care because they're only in this to defend their faith, not to come to actual, demonstrable, verifiable historical facts. They just really want to believe.
If you want to learn more about textual criticism and the transmission of the New Testament documents, I highly recommend a book called Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism by Peter Gurry and Elijah Hickson.
Which still doesn't matter for all the reasons that I've already gone into. In fact, I've had discussions with theists on this, and they always have problems with it. They can't understand the objection that the stories in the Bible just might not be absolutely true. That's a faith position, and I don't care about your faith. I care about your facts, and they don't seem to have any. Sorry, but you need to. They don't understand that we're not interested in the Bible. We're not invested in what the Bible says like they are. Everyone has to be just like they are, remember? Because in reality, Christians don't much care about any potential real Jesus. They're only interested in the stories told in a book of mythology about him. Most of these people think Jesus was white and spoke English and stupid shit like that. Obviously, that's not true, but you'd be surprised just how many Christians I run into that are certain that it just has to be because that's what they've been raised to believe. I saw a video not too long ago, I think it was by Prophet of Zod, but don't quote me, addressing a Christian video that insisted that Jesus was actually white. Now, I've seen this kind of thing repeatedly. I don't know that it's necessarily a racist thing, although there certainly might be some of that. I think it's more just a stupidity thing. Most of what we think about Jesus comes not from the Bible, but from the Catholic Church and European culture through the Middle Ages, and people today, a lot of them anyhow, they just don't ask any of the difficult questions to realize just how little we actually know about any of it, because they're not interested in the actual truth. They just want the comforting lie, and I find that to be tremendously sad, don't you?
You can also take an online course on textual criticism by one of the top textual critics in the world, Dr. Daniel Wallace, who's professor of New Testament Studies at DTS. I'll link to that below.
Don't listen to anyone who isn't already a Christian or anything, right? Because they might not be as biased as the religious wingnuts actually are. And of course, Alisa isn't going to get into any kind of objective truth because she doesn't care. No apologists do. They're just trying to get people to buy their books and come to their talks and put money into the collection plate because that's what this is all about. Cold, hard cash. That's why she already had her book up on screen and almost certainly will again. In fact, now that I think it's safe to look at her description, she's got her book down there too. Of course, product links are affiliate links, which means if you buy something, we'll receive a small commission. No link to any book or source that I ever provide in my descriptions ever give me any money. Not ever. I just think it's important to keep pointing out just how money-driven the religious always are, whereas I'm not. Anyway, that's where we're going to wrap it up for the week. Otherwise, we'll have to get into another question, and that's going to get way too long. She spent a long time actually getting to her questions, which is why we only got through one, and it wasn't a very good question to begin with. These religious videos are always awful, just pandering mindlessly to the faithful because they're really after their money and not after the actual truth. Sorry, but I figure truth is its own reward. I would rather know the truth and how I got there and how I can be sure that it's actually the truth than to have any amount of money rolling in. I mean, thank you to my patrons who are on screen right now, but even if every single one of them stopped, even if I never received another red cent ever again, I'd still keep doing this because I think it's more important to understand reality than to have my hands out for anybody's money. Sadly, the religious don't think that way, do they? Anyhow, we're going to come back next week for hopefully 2 more questions. I don't know, it depends on just how terrible these things are and how much time it takes to debunk them. But we won't know until we get there, so I guess you'll have to stick around and see just how bad this all turns out. I think we know it's not going to improve because this is religion we're talking about. It's either dumb or dishonest or both. Usually it's both, because that's what it always comes down to.